over the course of the past couple of months, we've been covering a theme called strange messengers that we find in the Bible. We've discussed, although we didn't have the strange messenger title to that particular lesson, it was about Belshazzar and the lessons that we could learn from the example of the writing on the wall, but we talked about the writing on the wall from Daniel chapter 5. We talked about Dagon in 1 Samuel chapter 5. And this morning, I would like to come back to that theme of strange messengers. And the idea of the theme are things, either whether they were organic or inorganic, but things that God utilized to send a particular message. And this morning, I want to discuss the quail, the manna, and the rock. And you might think, just from a cursory perspective, we remember our history of Israel, the quail, the manna, and the rock, there may not necessarily be any immediate thought that all three of those things are connected. But I'd like to suggest to you this morning that they are connected. And I'm also going to suggest and recommend that for the next several passages that we cover, there's going to be 6 passages we're going to spend quite a bit of time reading in this morning. And I would like to highly recommend that you follow along in your Bibles so that you can read along with me as we cover, starting with Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16, we're going to start in verse 1 of this passage. In Exodus chapter 16, starting in verse 1, we find that the children of Israel, they've come out of the land of Egypt. They've passed through the sea. They've journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Zin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they departed from the land of Egypt. So they have been traveling for about a month and a half or so. They have come to this place in the wilderness. The whole congregation, verse 2, of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." So they're all hungry, and now they're wishing they could go back to Egypt, which they claimed they had pots of meat and ate bread to the full. Never mind that they were slaves and oppressed in Egypt. In fact, so much so that their cries came up to the Lord that he sent Moses to deliver them. In verse 4, the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not." Now, I want you to just remember that particular phrase in verse 4, that I'm going to do this and I'm going to test them to see whether they're going to listen to what I say. Verse 5, God says, "On the 6th day they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily." And then Moses and Aaron said to all the children of Israel, "At evening you shall know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your complaints against the Lord. But what are we that you complain against us?" Moses said, "This shall be seen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and in the morning bread to the full. For the Lord hears your complaints that you make against him. And what are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord." So Moses wanted to make it crystal clear to the children of Israel that when they were complaining that we had meat and bread to eat in Egypt, and their complaints against Moses and Aaron were in fact complaints against God. 45 days, that's all that's passed. And there have been other events that have already happened. In fact, in our bulletin article this morning, we talk a little bit about an event just 3 days after the sea was parted and the children of Israel passed through the sea. They complained about bitter water. And God had to perform a miracle again for them to make that water sweet and acceptable to them to be able to drink. And how quickly they forget the signs and the miracles that God had done in Egypt, the plagues that he sent upon the Egyptians. So this is what God tells Moses to tell the people. behold, there's going to be meat aplenty for you tonight. And then in the morning, there's going to be bread aplenty for you to eat. And so we see in verse 11, the Lord spake to Moses, saying, verse 12, I've heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat. In the morning you will be filled with bread, and you will know that I am the Lord your God. So in verse 13, it was that quails came up in the evening, covered the camp. And in the morning the dew lay all around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance, as fine as frost on the ground. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? They didn't know what it was. And Moses said to them, this is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. So notice that evening, God had it so that quail covered the camp. Now I want you to think about, this isn't just a camping site where a couple of people are hanging out and quail just kind of surround the little camping site. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. And in fact, we're going to see later on when people are again complaining about meat, and God says, I'll provide meat, and Moses says, how is there any way to feed this many people? How are we supposed to get this much meat to provide for all of this for all of Israel? We're talking about a whole lot of meat, a whole lot of quail that all appeared at the camp, and were just, I don't know if they just all of a sudden just died, but they were there for the children of Israel to take and eat. And so then in verse 15, all of a sudden the next morning, here's this substance. And we read more about it throughout the different, between Exodus and Numbers. We read more about what this substance was like, what it tasted like when it was turned into bread. But we see in verse 21, they went out and they gathered, and we see they gathered it every morning, each man according to his need. And when the sun became hot, it would melt, which is kind of an interesting thing to note. Almost kind of like frost or snow would melt in heat. But again, this is manna. And in verse 25, Moses said, eat that today, for today is Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you will gather, but on the seventh, the Sabbath, there will be none. So it happened that some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, for the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you on the 6th day bread for 2 days. Therefore let every man remain in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people rested on the 7th day. Do you notice the whole reason why God did it that way? Why God arranged for them to have double the amount on the 6th day, so that on the 7th day, they wouldn't need an extra amount. They would have all that they needed for that day. But remember back in verse 4, he says, I will test them to see whether they will obey my law or not. And what happened in verse 28 and 29? God says, and when he says you, he's not referring to Moses. He says, why do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? It wasn't that Moses did, it was that Israel did. They went out and still tried to gather, even though they were told there would be none. Then in verse 31, the house of Israel called its name Manna. It was like white coriander seed, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. And in verse 35, Moses tells us that the children of Israel ate this manna, starting from this point on, over the course of 40 years until they came to the inhabited land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. So it's as if this evening of quail represented the end of their relying on things of the earth, the things that man would provide or nature provided. Now, from now on, starting the next morning, everything that they needed, everything that sustained them would be provided by God. It's almost as if the quail represented the end of their reliance on the earthly things, and the next morning began the reliance on things from heaven. Literally, in this case, manna from heaven. Well, then we go to chapter 11 of Numbers. In Numbers chapter 11, and in verse 1, very interesting, we kind of are dropped. If you read to the end of chapter 10, there is no context given as to exactly what's happening when we pick up here in verse 1 of chapter 11. But something's taking place. The people have complained about something, and God is angry. It says, now when the people complained, it displeased the Lord. For the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. And when the people cried out to Moses, Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire was quenched. And so he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord had burned among them. Taberah, the literal term Taberah means burning. So there's something that happens here right prior to verse 1 that they're complaining to themselves, perhaps, complaining about something. God is angry. He sends fire. So they call this place Taberah. Now, at some point between verse 3 and towards the end of chapter 11, they're going to leave that specific place, Taberah, and go to another place. It's called Kibroth Hattaavah. Now, we're not told when they leave Taberah and go to Kibroth Hattaavah, but these are two different places. They're always treated as two different places throughout references later on in the Old Testament. But as we continue in verse 4, we have the mixed multitude who were among them. They were yielding, which is to say they had these intense cravings, and they yielded in the sense of complaining. They yielded to intense craving. And so the children of Israel wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? So this is well long after the events of Exodus 16. They've been going, we don't know how long exactly, but they've been going for a time. And now God has been sustaining them with all they need of manna. And this bread, remember, it was like honey that was made with wafer. It sounds like a pastry to you and me, like almost like a donut type of thing. It apparently tasted very good, or would seem to have been. But in verse 4, these people are complaining that they have no meat. And notice what they seem to remember, verse 5. We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our whole being, notice what they say regarding this manna from heaven, our whole being is dried up, and there is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. Now you can almost hear the contempt in their voice when you read what they say. There's nothing at all but this manna. We want a smorgasbord. We want different options. We don't want to be limited to just this one dish. Back in Egypt, we ate like kings, apparently. Remember, they were slaves, and they were oppressed. But in their memory, they seem to remember eating fish as much as they wanted, and cucumbers and melons and leeks and onions and garlic and all that they could ever want, they had. But now, all we have now is this manna. Keep in mind that they still don't know what it is, because manna, in and of itself, the term manna means, what is it? They don't know, but it's from heaven. Now in verse 7, we're told once again, here in Numbers 11 and verse 7, the manna was like coriander seed. Its color was like the color of bdellium. And the people went about and gathered it, and they ground it on millstones or beat it in the mortar, and cooked it in pans, and they made cakes out of it. Its taste was like the taste of pastry prepared with oil. Now, it seems to me that Moses is helping us along here in verse 8 to tell us that this is really not something to complain about, because it tasted really good. Verse 9, when the dew fell on the camp at night, the manna fell. And in verse 10, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was greatly aroused, and Moses was also displeased. Then in verse 18, going to verse 18, God tells Moses, you shall say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. Verse 19, you shall eat not 1 day, not 2 days, not 5 days or 10 days or 20 days, but for a whole month. God's going to give you meat to eat for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. Because why? you have despised the Lord who is among you. You have wept because of him, or wept before him, saying, why did we ever come out of Egypt? So God, he says, all right, you keep complaining about this wonderful honey wafer-like substance that you can turn into a pastry thing that tastes like it's a pastry. You complain about that I fully and abundantly bless you with this, well, I'll give you meat. I'm going to give you meat until you're sick of it. So, verse 21, Moses responds to God, saying, the people whom I am among are 600,000 men on feet. That's 600,000 men. That doesn't include women and children. He says, you said I'll give them meat that they may eat for a whole month. Shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them? To provide enough for them? Shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to provide enough for them? Moses is like, how in the world, not just one day or 10 days, for an entire month, this is going to be impossible. And of course, with God, nothing is impossible. And in fact, the very next verse, verse 23, the Lord said to Moses, has the Lord's arm been shortened? You think I've lost power somewhere along the way? Do you think I'm running out of ability somehow to take care of my people? Now you shall see whether what I say will happen to you or not. And we go to verse 31. And what happens in verse 31? A wind went out from the Lord, and it brought, again, notice, quail from the sea. It left them fluttering near the camp, about a day's journey on this side and about a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits above the surface of the ground. Now, at this time, best estimates of a cubit was 18 inches. It was from the tip of your finger to your elbow. So you got to figure this is about 3 feet deep, full of quail. Well, that's a lot of meat. And so, verse 32, the people stayed up all that day, all night, and all the next day. Sounds like about 48 hours straight almost, gathering the quail. And he who gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. Now, between verse 32 and 33, apparently they've taken this quail, they've prepared it, they've got this huge amount of quail prepared, and now they're going to partake. And notice verse 33, while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was even chewed. In other words, they had bitten in to the quail. The wrath of the Lord was aroused against the people. The Lord struck the people with a very great plague. Verse 34, so Moses called the name of that place Kibroth-Hattaavah, literally, the graves of the longing, because there they buried the people who had yielded to their craving. Now, why would God do that? Why would God say, okay, you want meat? I'll give you meat. And so he sends this huge amount of food, quails, to the people. They stay almost 48 hours gathering all this food. They've got this feast all prepared. And as soon as they bite into it, this plague starts and it kills. We're not told how many it killed. But it kills many of these Israelites. Why? Well, specifically those who had yielded to their craving. Which is to say that this is what happened to them. But remember what we talked about back in Exodus chapter 16, how this quail almost seemed to symbolize the last of their reliance of being sustained by the things of the earth. Now they're going to be fully sustained by God with this manna from heaven. This was not a natural thing. This came from God. And just like their fickle hearts wanted to leave Egypt, and then constantly they were wanting to go back to Egypt every time some little challenge came up or some obstacle came up or something, their water was too bitter, they didn't like the water, didn't taste good, they kept wanting to go back to Egypt. Well, just in the same way, their fickle hearts were like that. Now they go from having to be sustained by the earth, now to being sustained by God from heaven, not having to go out and kill anything, not having to plant and grow stuff. And now what do? Now they want to go back again to being sustained by the things of the earth. They want to have everything Nothing was ever enough to sustain them, to make them content, to satisfy them. And so the name of this place, again, whatever happened verses 1 through 3, and it may have had some sort of connection to complaining about the food, but here in verse 34, 33, and 34, we find that this place that they've come to at this point is different from Teberah. This is Kibroth Hattaavah. And the reason why I make that distinction is because later on, these two places are going to be mentioned side by side as two separate events that caused wrath on God's part. But now we have another thing that happens. And there's a reason why I want to talk about this. Numbers chapter 21, and in verse 4, this is a shorter account that I want to bring up here. But in Numbers chapter 21, and starting in verse 4, we have the event of the serpents and the bronze serpent that Moses was instructed to create, that all who looked upon it would be healed if they had been bitten by the fiery serpents, the venom that was killing people. Well, starting in verse 4 of Numbers 21, let's look back at to what was it that brought on these fiery serpents. They journeyed from Mount Hor by way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And the soul of the people became very discouraged on the way. Verse 5. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is, what is it their complaint is again? There is no food and no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread. What worthless bread? Manna. Manna. And now we can kind of put chapter 11 and that contempt that you kind of read in that statement, and all we have is this manna. Well, now you can put that contempt to how they saw it. They considered it worthless bread. Once again, it's about being sustained. God's taking care of them. Is it that there was no food or no water? No. It just wasn't the food and water they wanted. And so they complained. All we have is this worthless bread that we don't have to go and prepare and collect and all this. All we have to go is take it off the ground and then mash it and put it in the oven and make it. That's all we have to do. It's really not really all that difficult at all. No, we want all the rest of it too. So, verse 6, the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people. Many of the people of Israel died. So they came to Moses and said, we've sinned. We've spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he'll take the serpents away from us. And so Moses prayed for the people. And of course, God responds about what to do about it. But it shows a consistent pattern regarding the fickle nature, fickle tastes almost, but more so the character of the children of Israel. Now, that has to do with the quail and the manna. Consider with me the two examples we have regarding the rocks that brought forth water for the children of Israel. At Rephidim and Kadesh, Exodus chapter 17. Remember, we looked in Exodus chapter 16, and this is when God first brought about the manna. They were complaining they didn't have anything to eat. God says, fine, I'll take care of you. And he brought the quail that night, he brought the manna the next day, and at the end of chapter 16, what are we told? For the next 40 years, God took care of his people by giving them manna. The very next chapter, what do we see? Then all the congregation of the children of Israel set on their journey from the wilderness of Zin. According to the commandment of the Lord, they camped in Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. And so did they say, well, the God has taken care of us already. He sent forth this, we don't know what it is, from heaven and has fed us. Surely God's great power and his great love for us, he'll take care of the water situation. No, they say in verse 2, therefore the people contended with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them, why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord? It wasn't a innocent, hey, do you think you can ask God to give us some water? It was contentious. They were upset. They were angry. They were afraid maybe. There's no water. What are we going to do? Verse 3, the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why is it you've brought us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and livestock with thirst? Oh, we have all the bread we could possibly want, but we can't drink it down." Verse 4, Moses cried out to the people, saying, "What shall I do with this people?" Notice his first response isn't, "God, we don't have water." That's not what Moses' thing is. "God, why? Well, what am I supposed to do with this people?" See, Moses understood. God, you've taken care of us up to now. You're not going to let us thirst to death in the wilderness. Moses knows that. They are almost ready to stone me, he says. Verse 5, the Lord said to Moses, "Go on before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel. Take in your hand your rod, with which you struck the river." That was at the parting of the sea. "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb. You shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink." So Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. Verse 7, he called the name of the place Massa, which literally means temptation or testing. And he also called it Meribah, which literally means contention or striving, arguing, because of the contention of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Well, I don't know. Who was it that separated the seas? Who was it that brought you all that quail that night? Who was it that gives you bread every morning? Is the Lord among us or not? That's what it means by testing the Lord. Well, if God's with us, well, let me see his power. Give me some water. In Deuteronomy chapter 9 and in verse 22 is the passage I told you about earlier, where Moses, in Deuteronomy 9 verse 22, he's talking to the children of Israel, and he's recounting kind of their journey as they had come out of Egypt and as they go through these places, and he recounts the times, every time almost, where the people complained or the people had an issue or there was some kind of obstacle, and God took care of it. Every single time, God's power, God's love for his people took care of the problem. Well, Deuteronomy 9 and in verse 22, Moses is also at Taberah, Numbers 11, verses 1 through 3, and Massa, Exodus 17, verses 1 through 7, and Kibroth-Hattaavah, Numbers 11, 31 through 34. You provoked the Lord to wrath. Now, I said at the beginning of the lesson, when we talk about the quail, the manna, and the rock, are these things connected? Moses connects them because in all three of those situations, they provoked the Lord to wrath. And how did they do it? By complaining, having doubt in their mind, testing Jehovah, and apparently forgetting all the things that God had already done for them. In Numbers chapter 20, and in verse 1, we have the second event. It's sometimes referred to as Meribah Kadesh, but the place was called Kadesh to start with, and then it was changed to Meribah Kadesh for the very reason we're going to look at. But once again, we have a similar situation. We find that Miriam has died here in Kadesh. Verse 2, there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron, and they contended with Moses, verse 3, saying, "If only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here?" Have they really that quickly forgotten what God has done for them? Verse 5, why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It's not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink. Notice they're still missing their variety, their selection. Oh, we've got this manna that tastes like, pastry honey and stuff. That's not good enough. Verse 6, so Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. They fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, verse 8, take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water, and thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock. Give drink to the congregation and their animals. So Moses took the rod. Verse 10, Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together. He said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted his hand and he struck the rock twice with his rod. Water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. Now you and I are aware that that wasn't the commandment of God. The commandment of God was that he was to speak to the rock this time, not strike it. Verse 12, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, because you did not believe me, to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you will not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Verse 13, this is the water of Meribah, also known as Meribah Kadesh, because the children of Israel contended, notice, didn't contend with Moses and Aaron, contended with the Lord, and he was hallowed among them. Notice what God says Moses and Aaron didn't do. You didn't hallow me before the people. But God was hallowed before the people. Why? Because God's power was still shown. As far as we know, the people didn't know what the specific commandment was to Moses and Aaron to do. They just knew that Moses did just like he did last time. He struck the rock twice and out came the water. Oh, God took care of us again, like he always has. But as far as Moses and Aaron, they didn't do what God told them to do. And in fact, we see this after a little while in verse 24, when it's time for Aaron to die, he's not allowed to enter into Canaan. God says in verse 24, Aaron shall be gathered to his people, for he shall not enter the land which I have given to the children of Israel. Why? Because you rebelled against my word at the water of Meribah. In Numbers chapter 27 and in verse 14, we find out about Moses. For in the wilderness of Zin, during the strife of the congregation, you rebelled against my command to hallow me at the waters before their eyes. These, and notice we're told these are the waters of Meribah at Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. Deuteronomy chapter 32, we're actually given the account where Moses goes up on the mountain to die. And God says in verse 51 of chapter 32 of Deuteronomy, because you trespassed against me among the children of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, because you did not hallow me in the midst of the children of Israel. Now, why are we talking about all of this? Remember what was said back in Exodus chapter 16, verse 4. I said, remember this verse. God says, I will give them this manna, and I will test them to see whether they'll do what I say. That was about that specific situation regarding the manna. But how quickly, how easy it is to forget the specifics, the details of what God says. Whether you're getting caught up in the moment, or some people think that Moses was not humble as he should have been here. Maybe that was a part of it, but what we know for sure is that he didn't do what God told him to do. He didn't follow the specifics of God's command. So, let's take this and let's try to gain some application from what we've learned regarding the quail, the manna, and the rock. In Psalm 105, starting in verse 1, notice what the psalmist says. He starts out in the first 5 verses reminding the children of Israel to praise Jehovah. And for the next entire psalm, he's going to tell them why. Verse 1, oh, give thanks to the Lord, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the people. Verse 2, talk of all his wondrous works. Seek the Lord, verse 4, and his strength. Seek his face forevermore. Verse 5, remember his marvelous works which he has done, his wonders and the judgments of his mouth. So then the psalmist kind of goes through the history. He talks about all these wondrous works. And then in verse 40, the psalmist says, the people asked, and he brought quail and satisfied them with the bread of heaven. He opened the rock, and water gushed out, and it ran in the dry places like a river. He remembered his holy promise, and Abraham his servant. He brought out his people with joy, his chosen ones with gladness. He gave them the lands of the Gentiles, and they inherited the labor of the nations. For what purpose? What did all of this lead to? What was it all about to teach? Verse 45. that they might observe his statutes and keep his law. That's why. That's why God did all that he did. He loved his people, but he wanted to instruct them, teach them, and he had at times to discipline them so that they would pay attention to what he said. And what does the psalmist end with? Praise the Lord. Because notice, at the end of all of this, at the end of 45 verses, 40 of which he talks about the history of Israel, praise the Lord. Look at how merciful and patient he's been with us. Look at how long-suffering Jehovah has been. How kind, how he's remembered the promise to Abraham. Because if it wasn't for that promise to Abraham, they would have been wiped out. In fact, God said as much in Malachi chapter 3. I, Jehovah, change not, therefore you're not wiped out. In Deuteronomy chapter 8 and in verse 1. Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 1. Notice the different calls to action by Moses. He says, every commandment which I command you today, you must be careful to observe, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land in which the Lord swore to your fathers. You shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would what? Keep his commandments or not. Moses says that's what all of this has been about. To test you, to humble you, to teach you to listen to him. Verse 3, so he humbled you. He allowed you to hunger. He fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know. Notice what the whole point of the manna is. That he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Now this is physical manna that God provided for his people. But what was the point of it? To teach them that it's not all about bread. The stuff of the flesh, food and water, that is not the most important thing in life. Yes, our natural human side of us, that's what we need to survive. But that's not the most important thing in life. What's the most important thing? Your soul. Whether you live or die makes no difference. The most important thing is your soul. That's why God tested them. That's why he allowed them to go to places that had no water. How are they going to act? What are they going to do? Let's see if they're going to remember that I've taken care of them. That's why there were places where they whined and complained that they didn't have all this food. That's why God made manna probably the way that he did. It was that single substance. It wasn't a whole multitude of different things with different colors and different tastes. God certainly could have done that if he'd wanted to, but he didn't. Are you going to listen to me? Are you going to recognize that there's more to life than what you can eat and drink? So he humbled them. Verse 4, your garments did not wear out on you. Your foot didn't swell these 40 years. You should know, verse 5, in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord your God chastens you. Therefore you shall keep, verse 6, the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and fear him. Verse 11, beware that you don't forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes that I command you this day. Lest, verse 12, when you've eaten and you're full and you've built these beautiful houses and you dwell in them and all this great stuff is happening in this land of Canaan, verse 13, verse 14, your heart's lifted up. You forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, who led you through the wilderness in which there were fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty land where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the flinty rock. Verse 16, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers didn't know, that he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end. See, human beings, and I think it's a natural thing, sometimes we get so caught up in instant gratification. In the moment. What have you done for me in the past 5 minutes, God? And yet, what was it part of the thing that God was to teach them? That he might test you to do you good in the end. To look further down the line. What you might think is good for you now may not be good for your soul. And what you may think isn't good for your physical life right now might actually be doing good for your soul. Verse 17, then you would say in your heart, because they've forgotten God and all this stuff, then you would say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth. Forget that God is the one who gave it all to us. No, we've done this. Verse 18, you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to give wealth, or to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he swore to your fathers as it is this day. And it shall be, if you by any means forget the Lord your God, and follow other gods, and serve them and worship them, I testify against you this day, you will surely perish. Verse 20, as the nations which the Lord destroys before you, so you will perish, because you would not be, notice our word, obedient to the voice of the Lord your God. That's why God allowed these things to happen. That's why when they murmured, did God punish them? Yes, he did. But he also gave them water to drink. He gave them the manna to eat to show them that he was going to take care of them. So what do we learn from all that? Well, the message from the quail teaches us a couple things. One, don't seek that which is of the earth. The quail seems to represent that which is of the earth compared to that which is of the manna, which is from God. Don't reject what God provides. Because what did God provide? He provided manna. The quail seem to represent their rejection of that. We want meat. Trust the Lord to provide as he sees fit. Not as you see fit, not as you think you need, but as he sees fit. Seek that which is from him, and do not dare call his blessings worthless. That still staggers my mind. This worthless bread. How dare us ever refer to something from God as worthless? And the message of the rock seems to be that God, in his almighty, all-powerful nature, provides and protects for his people. Again, as he sees fit. And we hallow, that means to set apart or make holy, we hallow him by heeding and obeying the details of his word. We shouldn't rebel or contend with or test the Almighty. And the last passage I want to share with you this morning, in Hebrews chapter 3, the Hebrew writer refers to all of these events as a whole. He says, don't harden your hearts as in the rebellion in the day of trial in the wilderness, again quoting from Psalms, where your fathers tested me and tried me, verse 9 of Hebrews 3. They saw my works for 40 years. I was angry with that generation, and I said, they always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Why? Because they didn't do what I told them to do. Thus the Hebrew writer says, beware, brethren, verse 12, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. Verse 14, we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. Then he says at the end of Hebrews 3, with whom, verse 17, was he angry for 40 years? Wasn't it those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? Yes, it was. To whom did he swear they would not enter his rest, but to those who did not obey? So we see they could not enter into his rest because of unbelief. Now notice verse 18 and 19 and the connection there. Unbelief versus disobedience. Unbelief and disobedience equate to the same thing, verses 18 and 19. People can claim to believe all they want to, but unless I obey, unless I listen to the details, it's not going to do a single bit of good. In 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 5, in talking about that history of Israel, Paul says, with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. And the question for all of you this morning is is God well pleased with me? Is he well pleased with me this morning if I'm not a Christian? I haven't been baptized for the remission of my sins, and yet I know full well that that's what God commands me to do. To hear his word, to understand he sent his son to die for me, and the need for me to obey his will. God is not well pleased with me. Those of us who may not be living as we should, we may claim to be Christians, and maybe we were baptized for the remission of our sins, and maybe we put on a good face, maybe pretend to have righteousness shining in our lives. But if we're not actually living it out every day, if we're not doing and being the example that we're supposed to be and doing God's will, God is not well pleased with us either. We offer an invitation. Consider your soul state, because that's what God's entire purpose for Israel, to learn that they needed to consider their soul first, not their body. Will you do the same this morning? If so, come forward as we stand and sing.